You're listening to The Real Deal. This is JFK Show number 45 with Don Fox. We're going to look into Permindex. This is a front organization suspected by the CIA, but we've got Don Fox who's looked into it a lot more than I have, so we're going to try to bring you some good information tonight. Welcome to the show, Don.
Hey, thanks for having me back, Gary.
Yeah, we had a really successful show. Lots of people liked it. Lots of, let's say, chatter in the CIA world out there. Lots of chatter after that show, so must be making a mark somewhere. All right, let's talk about Permindex, if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
That is correct. That's how it's pronounced. The best two sources I've had on Permindex are Tibor Rosenbaum, his book, Opium Lords, Israel, The Golden Triangle and the Kennedy Assassination, and then Final Judgment by Michael Collins Piper.
And it's just briefly mentioned in Jim Garrison's book on the Trail of Assassins. Is that correct?
Yeah, it comes up very briefly. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you were telling me last time that he kind of steered clear from that. He already had enough harassment coming from all angles without the wrath of Israel. Yeah,
he did put more info into a screenplay, I believe, that was never released. So he was painfully aware of the Mossad connection to the JFK assassination.
Okay, all right, well, let's roll.
Okay, so here we're going to start out with Tibor Rosenbaum's book on page 46. I got the ebook version now. This book is about 10 or 15 years old, the ebook, so some of this stuff he's kind of updated since then, but as far as the Permindex stuff, I think the version I had was pretty close here, so he starts out talking about Garrison. In 1967, New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison prosecuted New Orleans businessman Clay Shaw for conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy. Garrison suggested in his book, On the Trail of the Assassins, that Shaw received instructions from Lewis M. Bloomfield. In addition, Garrison discovered that Shaw and Bloomfield were board members of two trade organizations, Permindex and Centro Mondiale Commerciale, both expelled from Italy in 1962 for subversive intelligence activity.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, whoops. Clay Shaw was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and a polished manner. Born in Kentwood, Louisiana on March 17, 1913. During the 1930s, he worked in New York City as an executive for Western Union Telegraph Company and later as an advertising public relations consultant. By 1963, Shaw had become a wealthy real estate developer in New Orleans. He was director of the International House, the World Trade Center, which was, quote, nonprofit association fostering the development of international trade, tourism, and cultural exchange, unquote.
That sounds like a front, if there ever was one.
Well, that's kind of what Shaw was a front man. A well-paid front man, but nonetheless a front man.
Yeah, briefly let me say about Clay Shaw. Garrison could never figure out how a guy from Kentwood, Louisiana, a small town, could be amongst company of kings, queens, and people of the highest level of society when he had only gone to high school in Kentwood, and that's a really close town to here, and trust me, it's not like being from Paris, I'll tell you that.
Well, I think in the next few minutes we might be able to determine how exactly he rose from such humble beginnings to the only man ever prosecuted in the Kennedy assassination.
Kentwood to the world stage. Wow.
That's correct. And okay, so Rosenbaum goes on to say that researcher Jim Marrs wrote in his renowned book about the Kennedy assassination, Crossfire, the following description of Shaw's military background. By 1941, Shaw was with the U.S. Army, and while his official biography states that he was simply an aide-de-camp to General Charles O. Thrasher, Shaw later admitted he was working for the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, as a liaison officer to the headquarters of Winston Churchill. It is here that Shaw may have become entangled in the murky world of intelligence, although there is precious little reliable information on exactly what Shaw's wartime experiences included. He did retire from the U.S. Army in 1946 as a major, and later he was made a colonel with the Bronze Star, the Legion of Merit, France's Croix de Guerre, Belgium's Order of the Crown. And it's significant that Shaw received France's Croix de Guerre while serving as a colonel in the U.S. Army in the 1940s. So there's strong circumstantial evidence that Shaw may have also served as a colonel in the French espionage organization Service Documentation Extérieure et Contre-Espionnage, or the SDECE, under the aliases of Colonel René Bertrand and Colonel Beaumont. So he had aliases back in the 40s.
So that's the first time that Bertrand
comes up, yep.
Yeah.
And Jim Garrison proved that Clay Shaw often used aliases Clay Bertrand or Clem Bertrand. Danish journalist Henrik Kruger wrote in his 1976 book, The Great Heroin Coup, that Colonel René Bertrand, alias Colonel Beaumont, worked for the SDECE in the 1940s. According to Kruger, Colonel Bertrand used his influence in 1949 to get French gangster Joe Attia's prison sentence reduced from life to 4 years. Attia had been convicted in France for illegal possession of weapons and involvement in the murder of another gangster, and I'm probably going to butcher this, Pierre Lot Fau.
Now, I'll let you take the shot at it. I'm not going to give you a shot.
My French is pretty mediocre at best. Attia had saved Colonel Bertrand's life during World War II and evidently asked Bertrand to return the favor by getting his sentence reduced. Given that Clay Shaw was a colonel in the U.S. Army in the late 1940s, that he admitted to working in the OSS, and given that he was awarded France's Croix de Guerre, and given that Shaw resided in New Orleans, which has a strong French heritage, and given Shaw's known propensity to use aliases, it is possible that French SDECE officer Colonel René Bertrand, alias Beaumont, was actually Colonel Clay Shaw. This missing link about Shaw's background connects the dots to many of Jim Garrison's discoveries about Shaw's past, his links to international espionage, and his involvement in the assassination of President Kennedy.
Which he completely denied on the witness stand, but he denied anything to do with intelligence, anything to do with undercover work. It's all come to pass that he was just a lying son of a gun up there on the witness stand.
Yeah, and later on the CIA did admit he was a contract agent several years after his death. In addition, Henrik Kruger wrote that Colonel Bertrand, alias Beaumont, is one of the names most associated with SDECE espionage involving assassination, kidnapping, and other notorious scandals. Permindex was a Mossad arms trading and money laundering venture operating in conjunction with the Lansky organized crime syndicate. And Clay Shaw, a longtime CIA asset serving on the Permindex board, was a prime player in the New Orleans phase of the JFK assassination conspiracy. Therein, quite simply, lies the key to the mystery behind the JFK assassination. Therein lies the explanation as to why Jim Garrison's investigation of Clay Shaw, a director of Permindex, had to be scuttled. Not only had Garrison stumbled upon a definitive CIA link, but he had also inadvertently discovered the Israeli connection. But at the time, Garrison himself never even suspected how deeply the Permindex nexus went. Garrison had only come across the tip of the iceberg. I got a couple passages here from Michael Collins Piper. The fact is that when New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison prosecuted trade executive Clay Shaw with conspiracy and assassination, Garrison had stumbled upon the Mossad link. Although, after his acquittal, Shaw was revealed to have been a CIA asset. In 1963, Shaw served on the board of the Rome-based company Permindex, which was actually a front for a Mossad-sponsored arms procurement operation. A primary shareholder in Permindex, the Banque de Credit Internationale of Geneva, was not the only fiefdom of Tibor Rosenbaum, a high-level Mossad official, but also the chief money launderer for Lansky, who was chairman of the crime syndicate and longtime Israeli loyalist. Chief executive of Permindex was Louis Bloomfield of Montreal, a top figure in the Israeli lobby and an operative of the Bronfman family, intimate Lansky associates and patrons of Israel. Permindex was clearly the Israeli link to the JFK assassination, so much so that Jim Garrison himself later circulated the manuscript for a never-published novel in which he fingered the Mossad as a prime mover behind the conspiracy, although Garrison never otherwise mentioned a Mossad connection publicly. And the next passage here is from page 247 of Final Judgment, Michael Collins Piper. Central to understanding the joint Mossad-CIA-Lansky organized crime syndicate nexus in the plot to assassinate John F. Kennedy is to recognize the importance of a little explored corporate entity based in Rome and known as Permindex. New Orleans businessman Clay Shaw indicted by Jim Garrison for conspiracy in the JFK assassination, served on the Permindex board of directors. Many assassination researchers have contended that Permindex was a covert CIA money laundering operation. Shaw, of course, did have ties with the CIA. Others have put forth the theory that Permindex was a front for a Nazi remnant left over from World War II. This theory, exciting though it may be, falls far off the mark. All of the Furman evidence indicates that Permindex was an Israeli operation with close CIA connections and tied inextricably with the Meyer-Lansky organized crime syndicate.
All right, well, let's take a second and talk about the Meyer-Lansky organized crime syndicate. Can you kind of refresh our listeners to just who they are?
Well, Meyer-Lansky was basically the head of the Jewish mafia. He started out mainly as kind of the numbers guy. He was the accountant for the mob, but he was really good with facts and figures, and he could keep all this stuff in his head. So he kind of was in control of the gambling operation and the money laundering. The Italian mafia ended up basically subordinate to the Jewish mafia, or Lansky's operation. They ran basically all the casinos in New Jersey and Vegas. The Lansky operation was huge.
Yeah, I believe, was it Sheldon? I forgot his last name, but he owns most of them out there. Who is it?
Yeah, Sheldon Adelson.
Yeah, he's basically runs all the casinos out there. So when you go down to Las Vegas, you're basically going to Israel land, aren't we?
More or less, that's probably why it's been allowed to operate all these years out in the desert like that. Okay, then we'll get back to Piper here. Unraveling the mystery of Permindex explains the web of intrigue that ties all of the key players in the conspiracy together. The Permindex connection is also the famous French connection to the JFK assassination. And as we shall see, the French connection is actually the Israeli connection. Permindex was a Mossad arms trading and money laundering venture operating in conjunction with the Lansky organized crime syndicate. And Clay Shaw, a longtime CIA asset, serving on the Permindex board, was a prime player in the New Orleans phase of the JFK assassination conspiracy. Therein, quite simply, lies the key to the mystery behind the JFK assassination. Therein lies the explanation as to why Jim Garrison's investigation of Clay Shaw, director of Permindex, had to be scuttled, because they couldn't go there. It's one thing to expose the CIA. Most people know they're corrupt and got their fingers in most of the stuff going on in this country, but when you start talking Mossad, then you're talking about people that are foreigners that actually run the United States.
And they're not going to take it too kindly about you bringing up the fact that most of them are running our government.
That's correct, yeah. I mean, you can throw some corrupt CIA officials under the bus, but when the trail gets back to Tel Aviv, then the system gets
serious.
Yeah.
Yeah, Clara Kuhn said that if in Canada at this point, and I think Joshua Blakeney had said the same thing, just bringing up the J word in Canada and you can be brought to jail for hate speech. How about that one?
Yeah, I talked to Greg Felton a few months ago, and he was bemoaning the fact that Canada is really getting to be a Zionist-dominated country and that it's worse than it is here.
Yeah, Joshua Blakeney was saying that the reason they don't have false flags over there because they've given up the country willingly to the Zionists. I mean, no sense in blowing stuff up if they're just giving it up with no problem. Of course, they'll thwart a few terrorist attempts now and then, but it's just disgusting to me. And then you can't bring it up. So a lot of people thought, oh, you won't be able to use the N-word. Oh, you won't be able to call someone gay. That's hate speech. No, did they fool the heck out of everybody? And now we know exactly what it was for. And it's coming here unless we wake up.
Yeah. And Piper goes on to say here that Israel's Mossad was the key force behind Permindex. In fact, one of the chief shareholders in the Permindex holding company was the bank De Credit International of Geneva, established by Tibor Rosenbaum, the longtime director for finance and supply of Israel's Mossad. It was BCI, as we saw in Chapter 7 and Chapter 12 of Final Judgment, which served as Meyer-Lansky's chief money laundering bank in Europe. And according to Meyer-Lansky's sympathetic Israeli biographers, after Israel became a state, almost 90% of its purchases of arms abroad was channeled through Rosenbaum's bank. The financing of many of Israel's most daring secret operations was carried out through the funds in BCI. BCI also served as a depository for the Permindex account. Tibor Rosenbaum's BCI was a controlling force behind the enigmatic Permindex entity, places Israel and its Mossad in the very center of the conspiracy behind the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Clay Shaw's positioning in New Orleans, side of one of the operational rungs of the conspiracy, resulted in Shaw's implication in the investigation conducted by Jim Garrison, but the conspiracy went much deeper. Ultimately, as we now know, Garrison came to recognize that Israel's Mossad was intimately involved in the events in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. However, in the beginning, Garrison surely never even suspected it, and certainly had no reason to do so. JFK's secret war with Israel was an unknown factor in the geopolitical events of the period. Attention instead was focused on American involvement in Southeast Asia.
But as soon as the president's dead, all of this purchasing military equipment and things going right through these companies?
Israel had always purchased their arms through Rosenbaum's bank, BCI. So that was kind of separate from Kennedy, but Rosenbaum was a big factor. He was one of the players in the JFK assassination. So Rosenbaum was publicly involved in getting arms for Israel. All that stuff went through his bank. That was kind of an open secret, but Rosenbaum's involvement in the assassination of JFK was kept under wraps.
Well, let's talk about him for a little bit, because I'm not aware of him at all, and I've done a lot of study.
We'll get into Rosenbaum more in the second segment.
Okay.
I figure let's go on to another one of our favorite characters, Guy Banister.
Oh boy.
Here's a wholesome character. Now we're on page 420 and 421 of Final Judgment. What most people don't know is that Banister's best-known right-wing associates, Kent and Phoebe Courtney, were staunch supporters of Israel and widely suspected of being assets of the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. The truth about the Courtneys puts a new light on the Banister connection to the JFK assassination conspiracy. After Banister's death, at least a portion of his personal files came into Courtney's possession. And why is that significant? Many veterans of the American right generally believe that Kent and Phoebe Courtney were active infiltrators of the right wing, i.e. paid agents of the ADL, the American intelligence arm of Israel's Mossad. And although the Courtneys were, like Banister, outspoken anti-communists, they had engendered much distrust and dissension among their fellow conservatives by actively opposing and attacking figures on the right who had been accused of anti-Semitism by the ADL. Perhaps the most notable and readily documentable instance of this came in 1960, when a wide-ranging group of American conservatives were gearing up to form a third party to compete in the 1960 presidential election. Prior to that meeting, Mrs. Courtney sent out letters to some 30 different persons and organizations advising them that they were not welcome at the so-called new party meeting. All of those in question targeted by Mrs. Courtney were persons and organizations that had been scored for anti-Semitism by the ADL. Mrs. Courtney's action, needless to say, created much controversy among conservative circles, and in the February 1960 issue of Right, a clearinghouse for news and views of the right-wing movement, Vern P. Cobb, president of the American Council on Christian Laymen, released an open letter to Phoebe Courtney responding to her allegation that haters, or so Mrs. Courtney alleged, had infiltrated patriotic organizations for the purpose of creating dissension. There were widespread rumors within the right wing that not only were the Courtneys financed by the Stern family of New Orleans, but that Mrs. Courtney was related to the Sterns. Akita D. Shishmaref, a veteran right-wing leader, was among those who believed this to be true, but there were many others.
Yeah, the Stern family was actually the owners of WDSU television, which actually gave Jim Garrison his response, and were also the ones that caught Oswald handing out pamphlets.
So as we can see here, Guy Banister wasn't just a right-wing nut working, former FBI guy. He was also closely tied to Israeli intelligence.
Wow, just everyone, you start looking into it, just like Ed Lansdale, he was that way. I guess we're having to take a different look these days at what was really going on by what's going on today.
Yeah, a lot of these so-called patriots on the right-wing side, these so-called true blue Americans or whatever, turn out to be more loyal to Israel than they are the United States.
That's a fact. It seems like anti-communism was like the throw you off the track term back then.
Yeah, and maybe someday we'll do a show about how communism and capitalism are not that far apart. One of the tenets of, if you ever read the Communist Manifesto, one of their main tenets is to have a central bank and an income tax. Well, what do we have here in the United States?
Yeah, I have read that, and every single one it's too late?
Well, I mean, the Bolshevik Revolution was a Jewish revolution, and Stalin, Lenin, both Jews, tore apart Russia. So, really, again, that it shows you who was controlling both sides of the conflict and profiting off of it.
So, after the Bolshevik Revolution came the central bank?
Yeah, shortly thereafter. Yeah, once the Tsar was deposed. That's these revolutions that you see around the world, like in Libya, where the rebels come in, and then the first order of business is to set up a central bank.
Yeah, which was done in Libya, the first thing, the central bank out of London. First thing. It's amazing that we can be propagandized into doing something so heinous under the guise of bringing them liberty and democracy. All I can tell you, if your country is in rubble and just smoking ruins, you didn't get anything. And it's just amazing that our soldiers can be blindsided like that, to go in and do these horrific things under the guise of liberty and freedom and in this Israel that's pushing all these wars. It's all Israeli enemies that we're fighting, and I just can't believe that our soldiers just can't see that.
Well, they're heavily propagandized like the rest of the public, so it's tough. I was listening to Gordon Duff, and he talked about the fact that nobody that's alive today has ever fought to defend the United States.
Ever?
Yeah, never. We've fought, but it was not in defense of the United States.
It was defense of the central banks.
That's exactly it. Yeah, because a lot of people like to talk about how the dollar's a fiat currency backed by nothing. Well, that's not entirely true. It's backed by the U.S. military.
Yeah, and if you don't have a central bank, then we're coming after you. Like, who's left? We have Iran, Pakistan, I think. Just a few countries left.
No, Iran, North Korea. That's your axis of evil.
You're an axis of evil if you don't have a central bank.
If you don't have a Rothschild central bank, you're evil.
We just got a few more minutes left in this segment, so in summation, what would be the main thing that people should be getting out of all this, Don?
Okay, so out of the stuff that we covered here in the first segment, Clay Shaw was involved in French intelligence. He was involved probably in Army intelligence. He was in the OSS, and that he was on the board of Permindex. So Shaw had many aliases, and he had intelligence connections. And so Garrison was correct in the fact that he probably was a pretty decent-sized player in this. Now, did Clay Shaw actually order the hit on Kennedy? No, nobody believes that, but he certainly was, a fair way up the food chain.
Do you feel he is a witting participant?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I would imagine so. I mean, a guy like that, if he was really dead set against it, he probably would have passed on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the officer who arrested German scientist Von Braun was Clay Shaw. So if you're that high and you're part of Operation Paperclip, then you're up there. So I think Garrison was all over it, but he wasn't the prime guy. It's just that they killed everyone else that knew more.
Yeah, and in the second segment, we'll touch more on Tibor Rosenbaum, Louis Bloomfield, and the Bronfman family. All
right, you're listening to The Real Deal with Don Fox. This is JFK Show number 45. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back to segment 2. We've got Don Fox, and we've got one of the few shows in the JFK community about Permindex, and he's done a lot of research on it, and he's bringing it to you. God bless Don Fox and bringing the truth to us all, whether we like it or not.
Okay, thanks, Gary. Actually, a lot of this work was done by Michael Collins Piper, so we're kind of promoting his work here today. So we've got some excerpts here from Final Judgment and some other tidbits I dug up on the internet. This is stuff that I found helpful, in my own quest for the truth here, as it were, with JFK, and stuff I thought, not a lot of people talk about, and, Piper's work should get more promotion than what it has to this point. Mm-hmm. So, okay, we were discussing, kind of the who's who at Permindex. And just to review, okay, what is Permindex? Permindex was a Mossad arms trading and money laundering operation, and it worked in conjunction with the Meyer-Lansky organized crime syndicate. Meyer and Jake Lansky were two of the key figures in the Kosher Nostra, as it was known. And it appeared to be the Jewish mafia was superior to the Italian mafia. They kind of elbowed them out and took them over. So anyway, okay, so let's talk about a couple of the big names here. One, a big name, or should be a big name that you don't hear a lot of in JFK research, is Louis M. Bloomfield. He was based in Montreal, and Bloomfield was a longtime intelligence operative and a frontman for the powerful Bronfman family. The Bronfmans were not only key international backers of Israel, but also longtime figures in the Lansky crime syndicate. Bloomfield, one of the foremost figures in the Israeli lobby in Canada, and one of Israel's leading international operatives, not only served as the chief shareholder in the Permindex Corporation, on whose board of directors Clay Shaw also served, but also had intimate ties to American intelligence. And this is from page 252 of Final Judgment. Above all, the Permindex connection to Israel and its global intelligence network is best personified by the individual who served as chairman of the board of Permindex, Major Louis M. Bloomfield of Montreal, Canada, a devoted and influential supporter of the Israeli cause. It was Bloomfield who held half the shares of Permindex and its parent company, quote, for party or parties unknown, unquote. In fact, Permindex had its headquarters in Bloomfield's base of operations in Montreal until 1961, at which time it was relocated to Rome. Beyond question, Bloomfield, as we shall see, was a major player in Israel's international network. Bloomfield played a critical role in helping establish the State of Israel and its intelligence operation, the Mossad. In the years that followed, Bloomfield rose high in the ranks of the Canadian business world. He was reputed to control Le Credit Suisse Bank of Canada, Heineken's Breweries, Ken Scott Realty, and the Grimaldi Ciosa Shipping Lines Limited, and interestingly enough, the Israel Continental Company. But the key to understanding Bloomfield is his role as a founding partner in the Phillips, Feinberg, Bloomfield, and Goodman firm, which represents the Canadian-based Bronfman family interests. This rather intriguing detail suggests that Bloomfield's wide-ranging financial interests were, in fact, those of the Bronfman family. Thus, Bloomfield was essentially a frontman for the Bronfman empire. Okay, so that's a little background on Mr. Bloomfield. And another name that should come up more than what it does is Rabbi Tibor Rosenbaum, one of the godfathers of the State of Israel and the first director for finance and supply for Israel's intelligence agency, the Mossad. Rosenbaum was a prime financial angel behind the Permindex Corporation and a key figure in the JFK assassination conspiracy. His Swiss bank, the bank De Credit International, also served as the chief European money launderer for Lansky, chief of the global crime syndicate. Lansky's primary link with the Israeli intelligence and financial operations came through the entity of the Banque de Credit International in Geneva, Switzerland. This bank emerged as Lansky's primary European money laundering operation. This bank was the brainchild of one Tibor Rosenbaum. An Orthodox rabbi, Rosenbaum served for a period as international vice president of the World Jewish Congress, of which the Lansky-connected Bronfman family member Edgar Bronfman has served as president. Rosenbaum also was a co-founder of the World Zionist Congress and a director of the Jewish Agency in Geneva, Switzerland. However, and most importantly, Rosenbaum had served as Director General for Finance and Supply of Israel's secret intelligence agency, the Mossad. Rosenbaum was, very clearly, a key figure in Israel's international intrigue and a critical player in the world of organized crime syndicate boss Lansky. Rosenbaum, among other things, also served on the board of the Swiss-Israel Trade Bank, established by Pinchas Sapir, Israel's finance minister, and a Mossad officer. It was during this time that he served on the Swiss-Israel Trade Bank that Rosenbaum created the Banque de Credit International, or BCI. Investigative reporter Jim Hogan focused on the Lansky-Rosenbaum connection and its central link to Israel's international operations, particularly those of the Mossad. During the Second World War, Rosenbaum had become a hero of the resistance through his underground activities on behalf of the Jews. After the war, he became a delegate to the World Zionist Congress in Basel, where plans were made for the creation of Israel, and worked in various European capitals for the Palestine Liberation Office, which was the forerunner of the Jewish Agency. This is at the height of Zionist terror attacks in Palestine. A superb clandestine operator, Rosenbaum is said to have been instrumental in providing weapons to the Haganah and Stern gang. That would tend to explain why the International Credit Bank, i.e. the Banque de Credit International, or BCI, Rosenbaum's baby, quote unquote, became gambling czar Lansky's #1 conduit abroad. Rosenbaum was more than a friend of the Jews, however. When his bank was rocked with scandal after the collapse of Bernie Cofield's IOS, the newspaper Haaretz solemnly declared, Tibor Rosenbaum is Israel, and the paper wasn't far from wrong. While Rosenbaum's bank facilitated the flight capital schemes worked by IOS, it also served as a source of secret funds for the Mossad, Israel's intelligence service, and as one of the country's primary weapons brokers. Okay, now here's a story I came across on the Bronfman family from AmericanFreePress.net, again authored by Michael Collins Piper.
Okay. Man, this is complicated stuff. All right, go ahead, man.
Well, it's international intrigue, so it gets a little thick at times, so you have to read this stuff 2 or 3 times for it to sink in, kind of a who's who and who's doing what. But the story came out at the beginning of 2014, shortly after Edgar Bronfman passed away. The patriarch of crime syndicate connected empire that has operated in the sphere of the Rothschild dynasty is dead. On December 22nd, 2013, Edgar N. Bronfman, longtime head of the World Jewish Congress, WJC, died at age 84. New York Magazine once described him as a sometimes coarse, bullying businessman, but noted there are some people who would simply call him King of the Jews. Rabbi Michel Zion has hailed Bronfman as a modern Talmudic Jew, knowing that Bronfman's favorite book was the Babylonian Talmud, the hero of which, the rabbi admitted, is not God, but the cunning human scholar. Praising Bronfman's working fund scholarships for Jewish youth, the rabbi said Bronfman was the person who invited us to live Talmudically in the modern world. This recalls Meyer Rothschild, founder of the dynasty, with whom Bronfman's family has had long association. An admiring biographer once said that Rothschild was a zealous believer in the Talmud and chose it alone as the guiding principle for all of his actions. It is thus fitting that Bronfman biographer Peter C. Newman said the Bronfmans were, quote, the Rothschilds of the New World, unquote, estimating in 1978 that Bronfman assets totaled some $7 billion. In fact, Edgar Bronfman had a level of clout few could claim, precisely because of his frontline positioning in the Zionist movement and his family's pivotal historic role in the crime syndicate. Edgar was the son of San Bronfman, who immigrated to Canada from Russia and made his fortune in liquor, gambling, prostitution, and drugs. Going legitimate when he assumed control of the Montreal-based Seagram distillery, Sam forged links with the New York crime syndicate headed by another Russian Jew, Lansky, and during Prohibition supplied and thus controlled the spigot of liquor funneled into the United States and distributed by the Lansky mob. In many border towns in the northern U.S., there are family fortunes accumulated by locals who were part of the Bronfman network. And in the big cities, a connection with this syndicate was a must. In Detroit, the, quote, little Jewish navy, unquote, of Morris Dalitz, later Lansky's top man in Vegas, ferried Bronfman booze into the U.S. Even Chicago celebrated Italian-American gangster Al Capone to his own Bronfman connection. It was Lansky who sent Capone to Chicago from New York in the first place, assigned to work for Johnny Torrio, Bronfman's Chicago contact, who was moving to unseat Big Jim Colissimo as Italian-American mafia chief in the Windy City. Colissimo had alienated Lansky and Bronfman, whom he called dirty Jews, by asserting there was no future in bootlegging. Showing little interest in patronizing Bronfman liquor, he preferred to focus on drugs, prostitution, and loan sharking. So a Jewish hitman from New York retired Big Jim, and soon enough, Bronfman liquor flowed into Chicago. The media lionized Capone, but the Chicago mob, henceforward, was dominated by behind-the-scenes Jewish bosses. Now we'll go back to Final Judgment, and we'll touch on Jack Ruby and the Bronfman family. So behind the scenes, we're seeing a lot of Bronfman influence with some of these players, Bloomfield, Ruby, and some more modern characters, as we'll touch on here in a minute. Jack Ruby's covert activities were clearly well established, but independent researcher Brian Downing Quigg came up with a Ruby connection that had never before been revealed, exploring the corrupt world of Arizona mob bagman and political boss Kemper Marley, linked to the infamous 1976 murder of investigative reporter Don Bowles. Quigg learned from Marley's longtime publicist Al Lizenetz that not only had Lansky linked Bronfman bootlegging family been Marley's sponsors, but also that Jack Ruby himself was also on the Bronfman family's payroll. So when we consider the Bronfman family's intimate ties to the Permindex entity that clearly played a central role in the JFK conspiracy, The Ruby connection to the Bronfman family is interesting indeed and does point further to an Israeli connection. Okay, so the Bronfmans have had a wide range of influence, booze, banking, and all sorts of other illicit activities, but they also have a media presence, it appears. Alex Jones appears to have connections to the Bronfman family. So I found a story on the website, the AlexJonesMachine.com, and one of the pages on there goes after Jones pretty good. So the article starts out, who is Bahavi Lev? Bahavi Lev is actually Holly B. Lev. She changed her name. Well, I guess it depends on where she is and what she's doing to what name she uses. On the Organic India website, her profile says it was the summer of '96 when Holly B. Lev, an American traveler, came to India in search of answers to the void she felt in her life, hailing from a wealthy family in Virginia. And in the villages surrounding Kukrail, Bahavi, her Indian name, is an enigma. Edgar Sr., of course, has been, shall we say, a mover and shaker for quite some time. Some would refer to him as a mega-Zionist. The image above, which you can see on the site, shows him jovially shaking hands with the one and only Erich Honecker in Berlin in October of 1988. Edgar was in Berlin that day with some other notables like Peter Kirchner, chairman of the Jewish municipality of Berlin, and Werner Jarowinski. So Holly B. Lev is Holly Bronfman, sister of Edgar Bronfman Jr., and she's given up her privileged lifestyle. Maybe that's why she didn't go to the Four Seasons Turns 50 bash with her dad and her brother. But oddly, according to its Daily Double, Holly owns 100% of Lev Group Limited. Business seems to be pretty good for Holly, as the above-mentioned article states. Bronfman family's ties extend to a November 2006 deal listed in the above-mentioned SEC filing for a 3-year licensing agreement with Lev Group Limited for the distribution of Warner Music Group repertoire in Israel in digital and physical formats. Another odd thing for someone who gave up a privileged lifestyle, she holds approximately 6,424% in Treetops, as in Treetops Acquisition Group LP, as in the Federal Reserve System, Israel Discount Bank Limited, Tel Aviv, Israel. So it sure seems like Holly didn't give up as much as was touted.
And so Holly is
Edgar Bronfman's daughter.
Okay.
Holly is a Bronfman, and she's making money on deals with the family through various entities. Where the Alex Jones connection comes in is they share the same lawyer, Elizabeth Schurig. Up until 2007, David Sewell was taking care of Alex Jones' business up until the summer or fall of 2007. And then Alex and Kelly Jones, she also goes by Violet, they got a $725,000 house on August 30th, 2007. And Elizabeth Schurig, who's Holly's lawyer with an obvious connection to the Bronfmans, is now taking care of business for the Joneses and setting up several Jones companies in mid-November 2007. Elizabeth Schurig stepping in, and she got busy correcting company documents the first week of the new year, 2008, taking Mrs. Kelly off of everything and making address changes. So she went through several of Jones' business entities, updated the address, and took Kelly off the documents. But as it turns out, several of these Jones business entities have their address listed as Elizabeth Schurig's office. And Elizabeth works for the Bronfman family. So it's not a big stretch to conclude that Alex is working for the Bronfmans as well.
Yeah, I followed Alex for a long time, but I have to admit, he's just really not bringing the truth anymore.
Yeah, I was a PrisonPlanet.tv subscriber for several years, and then I started running into stuff like this. And I gave money to the Money Bomb a couple years.
Yeah, I did as well. The fact is that I'm looking into stories, and there's just so many false flags, like the Paris fake news story, and he's pushing it just like the mainstream media, and I've already looked into it, and it's just one thing after another. Even like Sandy Hook, he still believes that there were children killed there. Something happened to Alex along the way.
Well, his wife is Jewish, so that makes his kids automatically Jewish. And, if you listen to the show regularly, you'll know that most of the sponsors and guests are Jewish. Max Kaiser, who I find extremely entertaining, he's an Ashkenazi Jew. His old storable food sponsor, Steve Schenk, he's an Ashkenazi Jew. Marty Schachter, 5-Star Soap, he's an Ashkenazi Jew. The list goes on and on.
What about Midas?
That's Midas Resources with Ted Anderson.
Right.
Yeah, Ted is not a Jew, but he appears to do a lot of business in that direction.
All right.
So I stopped listening to Alex, was it last April, when that Bundy Ranch thing went down?
That did it for me.
Yeah, I was like, okay, I can't do this anymore. Even, I had my doubts about Alex, but that kind of removed all of them.
Yeah.
And,
how do you have a flagpole in the middle of the desert in 24 hours? You have to have cement. You got to get out there with the trucks. And so suddenly, out in the middle of the desert, there's a flag already planted. And then the more you looked into it, it's all on green screen. It's such an embarrassing false flag story.
Yeah, when that went down, and it turns out I think some of those people that showed up there were paid to show up by either the Birch Society.
Who's the one that attacked Fetzer the most? He was there.
Pete Santilli?
Pete Santilli, that's the one.
Oh, yeah, I've got my run-ins with Mr. Santilli.
I mean, that's the most obvious we have, and they were all there, and the whole thing was just a big hoax. It's just terrible and embarrassing. And that's that's when I finally made up my mind, just like you, that, okay, you try to give the benefit of the doubt for a long time, but it just didn't happen this time.
You know, in 2007, 2008, I had my doubts, because I'm not a conservative by any stretch of the imagination, but, you know, I listened to Alex because it's like, well, what I'm hearing here is closer to the truth than what you get on CNN or a lot of other places, yeah, but now I think he's pretty much turned into a Glenn Beck or Pete Santilli. Is not much of a difference there between those guys.
I still believe he brings a lot of good information, but it's the other 20% that it's not that bothers me.
Well, he gets some really good guests, you know. I mean, Max Kaiser will tell you what's going on Wall Street, but you got to know where Max Kaiser's coming from. You know, he was pushing that Bitcoin or whatever.
Yeah, I knew.
You know, and that's a big scam too. Even Alex wouldn't shill for that thing.
Yeah, I didn't know much about the Bitcoin thing. Got a couple of minutes left, so let's go ahead and polish JFK number 44 off.
Okay, so just to wrap it up here, we've seen a lot of the players involved in Permindex, which was basically a Mossad operation. And Jim Garrison had started to dig that out, but he didn't really publicize it. Apparently, I did run across a researcher today somewhere that had seen Garrison's unpublished manuscript it was going to be like a fictional type work, but he had Mossad as being responsible for the Kennedy assassination.
Well, I know his son Jasper personally. Maybe we can get a hold of the manuscript and publish it ourselves. That would be great, don't you think?
That would be something worth doing if we could track that down.
Well, I talked to him yesterday. He's just a nice guy. We had him on the last JFK show. He knew about the media a long time before we did because his father went through it all, and he never knew anything else, even though he was only 10 years old.
Yeah, I don't know if there's been a more demonized figure by the American media than Jim Garrison,
Right, and some of his children have actually fallen for the propagandists. All right, well, we've taken on this incredible task of Permindex, which Clay Shaw was on the board. So let's say, in the end, if we can just maybe wrap the whole thing up to how all these ties bring it back around to Dallas, Texas.
Well, Permindex, you see a lot of the New Orleans people involved in that, Clay Shaw and his crew. But in Dallas, it turns out there was a lot of Jewish people and Zionist sympathizers in the city of Dallas that helped pull the whole thing off.
Like helping control the parade route?
Yep, the parade route. In fact, weren't you telling me that the owner of the Texas Theater was Jewish?
Yes.
So
you think of a shit-kicking town and everyone's got boots on and they're roping cattle all day long.
No, they're not all wearing 10-gallon hats. No, they're wearing yarmulkes. The power brokers in Dallas. So we see...
There's a Federal Reserve in Dallas, Texas, so there you go.
Yep, so the Jewish connections to the Kennedy assassination are myriad. You know, JFK had basically a secret war going with Israel. Even before he became president, when he was a senator, he had voted for Algerian independence, and the Zionist lobby didn't like that at all. So Kennedy got off on the wrong foot with those guys back in the 50s. And he tussled with David Ben-Gurion behind the scenes about Israel's illicit nuclear program.
And he resigned over the fact that he wasn't going to get any nuclear weapons.
Correct, yeah. And then Kennedy started issuing his own debt-free currency from the Treasury Department. And that did not sit well with our Zionist friends over at the Federal Reserve.
Exactly. I think that's one of the most underreported things, is that he was preventing Israel from getting the nuclear weapons.
Yeah, because even to this day, Israel doesn't admit they have nuclear weapons. They have a policy of nuclear opacity or nuclear ambiguity. They neither confirm nor deny, but it's pretty much an open secret that they've got probably at least 1,000 warheads.
Almost everyone in our government is dual citizen, so what else can I say?
Yeah, the Dov Zakhines and Michael Chertoffs and the Paul Wolfowitz. There's quite
John
a few
Bolton,
of those.
Scooter
John
Libby.
Bolton. Scooter Leibowitz.
See, Henry Kissinger's been with every single president since LBJ. Just Google Henry Kissinger and any president, and you'll find a picture other than JFK.
Yeah, apparently Kissinger, I was reading today somewhere that Kissinger was sent there to control Kennedy, but after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy got wind of it and booted him out of the White House.
Oh, he booted Henry Kissinger out of the White House?
Yep.
I think we've got a new trail to follow down the Kennedy assassination.
I was thinking that today too. This morning. I was eating my omelet about 6 a.m. and I stumbled across that, and I thought, "Wow, I hadn't heard that one before."
If that's true, man, we're going to have to just reevaluate everything. My goodness. All right, so let's go ahead and get our final thoughts in. We're just about out of time.
Okay. So previously, we've heard a lot of, CIA or military that was behind the assassination, but really you have to go up a level. Who does the CIA work for? Who does the military work for? And then you're going to start to run into that top level of power, and they're the Zionists.
Mm-hmm. And whose wars are we fighting? And it's quite obvious to me. All right, Don, it's a great show once again, and I really appreciate all your hard work on Permindex. It comes up in JFK all the time, and no one till now has addressed it that I'm aware of.
Piper was talking about it, but he was kind of a lone voice in the wilderness.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just kind of promoting some of his stuff here.
Right. Well, it's the only JFK show I know of where they're talking about Permindex.
You won't hear it over at Black Op Radio.
I've pretty much given up on those guys. We don't even really worry about them anymore. We know when we're humiliating what they're doing, so we're not even worried anymore. All right, Don, appreciate it. We'll have you back on the show soon again. You're one of the best guests we have. All right, thanks again.
Thanks for having me, Gary.